Thank you very much, and welcome to the committee, colleagues. It's nice to see your presentations. Professor Christians, I'll start with you if that's okay. In your paper, Trust in the Tax System, the problem with lobbying, you write that politically astute, well-resourced individuals and multinationals work diligently to influence the shape of the law. So, Professor, could you explain, even on an abstract level, how lobbying by investment firms shapes tax laws to allow layers of subsidiaries in jurisdictions like Bermuda and the Cayman Islands to shield profits from Canadian taxation?
I don't know what you mean by shield profits. If you're talking about profit shifting, I can answer that question.
Sure.
Okay, so the issue of profit shifting is something that is globally in scope, and all countries have this problem where through the use of complex rule sets and a lot of judgment and a lot of discretion on the part of the taxpayer, which is given by Parliament, companies arrange their affairs to reduce their taxes. That is globally the case. And so Canada is part of a global effort to create a minimum corporate tax to prevent or deter or get rid of the incentive for moving things to lower tax jurisdictions. This has been going on for decades. And that is a problem that all countries face. That is, that we both want to attract capital. So we want to reduce our taxes on capital from outside. And we also want to raise taxes, which means we don't want to over compete when it comes to reducing taxes on capital. And so what you find there is that multinationals, but really anybody that has a capacity to hire a lobbyist, will tell you the exact same thing. And I'm sure you've heard it many times, that in order to get jobs and growth, you have to reduce taxes on them. And so the government, Parliament, over the years in Canada, as every other government in the world has done, has made legislative choices that reduce taxation in order to spur economic growth. So that's the issue of profit shifting, and it's not in any way limited. I'm not even sure which two jurisdictions you named or why you named them, because those aren't the problem. The problem is not those
Right.
jurisdictions.
I appreciate. I mean, those are jurisdictions that are impacting how the Prime Minister's own disclosures work. So I was curious about the impact of that. Your colleague, Mr. Knoble, had just said that the blind trust misuse is an actual issue, in that it does not have sufficient safeguards, and an antidote to that could be transparency and disclosures, perhaps even some sort of automated alert systems. Do you think that, in the spirit of accomplishing the transparency you've described in your paper and in your testimony today, that the Canadian government today is pursuing that type of transparency and that disclosure around blind trusts?
Are you speaking about in the Conflict of Interest Act or in the case of the Income Tax Act?
In the Conflict of Interest Act, which is the subject of this committee.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not an expert on the Conflict of Interest Act, so I won't be able to answer that question.
And then if you tried then to look at it from the Income Tax Act provision for disclosures of foreign held assets and tax havens?
Yeah. So a tax haven is not a technical term, and it is not a term. It's just simply not a term. Every country has aspects that make every country could be accused of being a tax haven, including Canada itself. So, I don't know, I don't recognize that term, and I can't use it for you. What I can tell you is that the obligation to report information in the Income Tax Act is sophisticated and it is broad, and there are a few exceptions, and they are highly technical, and you could read through those and see what the exceptions are.
Thank you. Mr. Knoble, in the short time I have left, maybe I'll turn to you, because you did look at what tax haven policy could be by different parties in Canada, its definition, and how different parties would act and react to the situation that Canadians are impacted by. You said in the report had noted that the Carney government was the only major party in the 2025 election that failed to address tax havens. Why do you think that is, sir?
I mean, I would say I do not know enough about Canadian politics to answer that, but I would say that in most countries, they tend to fail to properly address tax havens, many times because of political pressures of different countries. and because they don't use objective criteria. Many times there are national tax havens, even international tax havens, even by the EU, and it's not very clear why they do that. That's why even we offer this financial secrecy index and another one that is focusing more on tax abuse or tax avoidance called the corporate tax haven index, where we try to explain why each country, including Canada, has provisions that could be always be improved, either to become more transparent and also to reduce these tax minimization or avoidance or abuse provisions.
And then do you think that it's ethical for a sitting prime minister to benefit from tax havens with assets that are held in blind trusts?
I would say two different things. The main thing is that I would personally not really differentiate between if it's through a blind trust or through a trust or through another type of vehicle. I think any exploitation, and I would also say, although of course any public officer has, I feel like, a larger responsibility because of their position, we would still expect, or I personally, every citizen not to be undermining the rules that apply to everyone else. So that usually happens with multinationals or high net worth individuals, maybe also with politicians, that can, either through lawyers or accountants or big law firms, find ways to still pay less or be less subject to the rules that apply to everyone else. I completely agree that that should stop.
Okay.
Of course, for a public officer, there is a more responsibility, but really we should
Thank
stop
you.
that for everyone.
Thank you,
Minutes,
sir.
go ahead,
Thank you,
sir.
Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Knoble, I just want to go through some of your testimony and to make sure that I understand it correctly. Is it accurate that blind trust misuse is a problem?
The question is whether blind trusts are a problem. Is that the question?
Is blind trust misuse a problem?
I mean, I would say any misuse of a company or trust is a problem. I would also personally think that.
Thank you for that. And therefore, as I understood your testimony to be, that blind trusts are not a sufficient safeguard.
Correct. Could I expand on why? Or
And what I understood you to say was that the best safeguard is transparency. Did I get that right?
yes.
Okay. So we have a prime minister whose answer to everything is that all of my assets are in a blind trust, so everything is okay. Now, that, based on your testimony, that isn't sufficient, but there's an even bigger problem, and that is because the Prime Minister set up 3 multi-billion-dollar investment funds that he registered in Bermuda and the Cayman Islands. The Prime Minister is entitled to something called carried interest pay. That's essentially future bonus pay based upon the performance of those funds. The Prime Minister picked the companies. He knows what the holdings of these funds are. He's disclosed the 3 funds, but he has not disclosed what the holdings are in these funds. And therefore, the Prime Minister is not being transparent about potential conflicts of interest. So would you concur that even if the Prime Minister isn't technically by law under the Conflict of Interest Act required to disclose the holdings of those funds that he set up, in the interest of transparency, shouldn't he?
I mean, I understand that people will usually abide by whatever laws they have to comply with. And again, of course, a prime minister or a public official has a higher responsibility or a higher role model. I would still expect any citizen, especially high net worth individuals, to still disclose all the assets that they have. I do not think that a blind trust can create enough safeguard to ensure that no problems will be there. So it's much better for at least authorities to know exactly what assets are held in a trust. But in the case of a prime minister or another public officer, ideally the full general public would know what's there, and then they can judge whether any conflict of interest is happening with a government contract or with any other transaction, instead of simply having to rely blindly on what is happening.
Now, we have a prime minister who has tens of millions of dollars tied up in offshore tax havens. Technically, under the law, he can do that. As you note, the prime minister really ought to be held to a higher standard as a public office holder, as the highest public office holder in the land. In your view, should the Conflict of Interest Act be amended to prevent public office holders from using tax havens? Does that, to you, seem like something that would make sense?
I mean, again, as I said earlier, I feel like the biggest concern is what is defined in the country as tax haven, because if you're only covering maybe small islands, they can still be using major financial centers that might not be considered a tax haven by Canada, but can create just as many risks as a small island. And I would expect that, again, to be used for everyone. I mean, like that same standard. Of course, a public officer, but anyone that there will be a disclosure. Maybe some countries have chosen for full prohibition of going for a tax haven. At least another alternative to be explained why exactly you need to go to a tax haven, why only a tax haven would offer you something, and whether that is a reason just to reduce their taxes or escape other laws that would apply in Canada to anyone else, or if there's a good reason that is not about a tax, it's not about reducing taxes or escaping any law. So maybe there is one, I can't imagine one, but maybe they have a reason.
Okay. So, thank you, Mr. Knoble. Merci, M. Thériault. M. Hardy, pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, M. le Président. Alors, la question va être pour Professeur Christian.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Professor Christians. You talked about the distinction between tax avoidance, tax evasion, what's legal and what's not, and what's being abused. Multinationals that use these complex processes for tax avoidance and abusive tax avoidance, do you believe that they're betraying the country in which they're having gains and they're not paying their fair share in taxes? And do you believe that $6.5 billion in 5 years, is that an abuse?
I didn't catch the last part about the 6.5 billion. I'm sorry. I didn't hear the point.
Est-ce que
$6.5 billion over 5 years in non-payment of taxes to a country, is that something that is acceptable?
I don't know what you're talking about, so I'm not able to answer that question, unfortunately. I will say that the Parliament defines avoidance very carefully in the Income Tax Act, and Parliament defines abuse very carefully in the Income Tax Act, and the courts have to interpret those rules. And every taxpayer has to live with those rules. So it's really Parliament's prerogative to say what the rules are, and Parliament's duty to tell the taxpayers what the rules
Je
are.
vais vous arrêter là, Professeur
I'm going to
Christian.
have to interrupt you. I was wanting to know your opinion and not what the law states. We want to make sure that things are ethical. I do understand what you're saying, but in your opinion, is it okay for companies making billions of dollars to avoid paying taxes in a specific country? And in a specific case, Brookfield, the company that our Prime Minister used to lead, avoided paying $6.5 billion in taxes over 5 years. Is that ethical?
The only way that I can answer this is to say that every person in this room that has an RRSP is avoiding tax. Every person that has a registered education savings plan is avoiding tax. Those are things that Parliament has provided. So if you're asking a question about ethics, that is not an area that I'm able to testify on. What I can tell you is that the law expresses our shared expectations. And we have shared expectations that people will follow the law. And if there's not tax evasion, then there's not tax evasion.
Merci beaucoup.
Unless and until Parliament
Merci.
says there is.
Dans le fond, vous nous dites qu'on doit juste...
Thank you. So you're saying that we need to look at the text of the law and not look into ethics. So I'm going to move on to Mr. Knoble. Brookfield is the #1 country for tax evasion in the past 5 years. $6.5 billion was not paid in taxes. Do you believe that it is legitimate for Canadians to asking questions on its government's capacity to defend the tax system? And do you believe that it is right for Canadians to ask their Prime Minister to show his portfolio in order to better understand the situation?
Is that question for me?
I believe it was, sir. Yeah.
I would completely agree that, again, all public officials should be transparent, especially if there is a risk or at least a perception that they might not be applying the law the way everyone else who is not going to a tax haven is. And I think it's also up to countries and up to parliament to close loopholes and prevent and try to stop anyone from, again, undermining the laws that would apply to everyone else who is not able to hire lawyers and have offshore operations. I mean, again, the law should hopefully make it fair for everyone.
Merci. Donc, si je comprends bien votre réponse et qui, je crois,
So
est
if I
très...
understand your response, and I believe that it's a good one, so the Prime Minister, who is the highest figurehead in our country, should lead by example. And in the case before us, this person was at the head of a company that was a champion in tax avoidance. And if that person isn't transparent, well, it's inciting other companies to do what he has done. Is that correct?
I mean, again, I understand that any public officer, not just a prime minister, I think any minister or any public official has that responsibility, but I feel also every other citizen. The expectation is that no one within a country will be using offshore jurisdictions or tax havens to undermine and be able to escape the laws that do apply to everyone else, especially those that are less sophisticated or cannot hire lawyers or anyone. Transparency, I think, is a very good starting point for citizens to know what is happening, and then if there is a need to then change the laws and prevent those unfair situations from happening. Even if they are legal, they might be unfair, and so I think it's up to Parliament to change that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Colombo. Merci, Monsieur Hardy.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr.
Before we start, a little technical issue before my clock starts. I would like to say something to interpreters. We're talking about a technical matter here, and in French, when we're talking about tax evasion, that's illegal, and tax avoidance is legal, and I'm hoping for the interpreters to ensure that they understood the difference so that the witnesses can understand my questions fully. I would like to start by thanking you for the information that you have shared with us. We all know that the world is changing, and we need to review the Conflict of Interest Act. It's important to say that as a politician, I want to bring ethics back into politics. I wanted to be sure that I mentioned it because if I refer to any specific cases, it's just to identify the problem to see whether or not we need legislative changes. Now, ethics focuses on what should be done, and ethics requires more than what is legal. And for an example, we could say that it's not because something is legal that it is moral. When I asked this question to the former clerk of the Privy Council, do you consider that tax avoidance is moral? He quickly asked me what that had to do with the Conflict of Interest Act. I responded that it does have an impact on the Conflict of Interest Act. And Mr. Knoble, I would like to ask you, why are these tax havens legal? It's because legislators have created a system that benefits them. What do you think of such a statement?
Thank you for your question. I would agree that many people benefit from tax havens, and I think that is quite unfair. I mean, if it's legal or illegal, that might be up to different countries. Some countries do make it illegal to have transactions or assets in tax havens, others don't. But the idea that some individuals and some citizens and some companies, usually large companies and usually high net worth individuals, when compared to lower income individuals or small and medium companies, that they can usually escape many of the regulations that would apply to everyone else just because they have operations or they have bank accounts or they have companies in tax havens or secret jurisdictions. I think that is quite unfair. Of course, starting with transparency, that is the first step. But I agree with you that countries could also go much more beyond that and start regulating what people can do or not in tax havens. But again, the main issue is, what do you consider a tax haven? And many major financial centers, just because of the political pressure, will usually not be identified either in national tax haven list or in international ones, like by the OECD or the FATF or by the EU. And that's why I think it's important to also use these objective criteria and then treat every country the same.
Un des objectifs.
One of the goals of our current study is to strike a balance between rebuilding trust, rebuilding Canadians' trust in their public institutions, and the Ethics Commissioner's concerns that rules shouldn't be too strict so that people from the private sector would no longer want to join politics. I disagree with that. I believe that we need to simply define the criteria that would need to be followed. And a person could decide after that whether or not to join politics. There are sacrifices to be made with a political career, and it's not because you're coming from the private sector that you have more knowledge. And if you truly seek to work in the public's interest, well, it might require that your personal interests need to be put on a back burner. What do you think of that statement?
I mean, I would say, and again, I am not an expert on these issues, but at least my personal opinion is that for sure you would expect, I mean, of course, politics should be open to everyone, but maybe I'm based in Argentina, which is a country that maybe trust and the rule of law applies maybe less than in other countries, maybe in Canada. And I would say that politicians have a huge role in that. They are, in a way, a role model. And when the citizens feel like their own politicians do not respect laws, still do not pay taxes, or even escape the law altogether, that in a way gives them some kind of entitlement to also do the same. So I would say that, of course, Parliament and politics should be open for everyone, but I do think we should have a high standard of what to expect of their conducts, because they will have huge implications on how everyone else will be trusting the system and also complying with laws by themselves. So for sure, I would expect people to be subject to high standards, not to exclude anyone. I mean, I don't think being from the private sector or not should be a criteria there. It's more how they are behaving and how compliant they are with the laws that apply to everyone else.
Je sais pas combien de temps il me reste là.
I'm not sure how much time I have left. Not a lot at all. I wanted to discuss what Professor Christian raised earlier around the minimum corporate tax of 15%. This raised a question for me regarding the behavior of our current Prime Minister, but I'll come back to that in a future question. I believe that if we want to have rules in order to rebuild trust in the political apparatus, we need to find rules that will suit the highest position of a country. They need to be exemplary and have the highest level of transparency, but I'll come back to that later.
Merci.
I feel limited in a way. Our witnesses are very competent, and my questions have to do with the Conflict of Interest Act. One of the matters that we are seeking to look into is that in the Conflict of Interest Act, we only look at one's personal interests for a conflict of interest, whereas some are saying that we need to look into decisions that have a more general impact, but that could also lead to a conflict of interest. And I'll give you an example. We know that Canada loses about $15 to $30 billion per year, and there's an abusive use of tax havens, and that is increasing. Brookfield was described to us by witnesses as being a champion of tax avoidance. Our Prime Minister used to be at the head of Brookfield. Could we then think that legislation on tax evasion would be well received by a Liberal government, especially given that this person coming from the private sector has interests in that company and made it grow? And so that's just one example of a conflict of interest with a decision that has a more general impact. This is a question that we need to look into, because when the Prime Minister moved headquarters to New York, and then at the G7, he excluded American companies from paying that minimum corporate tax of 15%, does that not raise a bit of a red flag? Should we measure whether or not that is something that is ethically responsible? That's the kind of question that we have here. Mr. Knoble, what do you think of what I've just described? Should we focus on this? And are we right in being concerned?
Mr. Knoble, I'm going to give you about 45 seconds to answer that, if you don't mind, sir.
Hopefully, this idea of more transparency and especially some kind of alert system, even to say this law might affect the interest of a prime minister or any other public officer and alert citizens, I think that would be the best thing. They should know that there might be a potential conflict of interest, and at least have public outreach, articles, or requirements to change things. So I think transparency is the only way to achieve that and really hold governments to account and make sure that they are really serving the country and not just their own interests.